Professionals. With that said, I give you Mr. Mike Anderson.
Thank you very much. Hey, can I get the clicker? Good morning, everyone. How's the sound? Is it okay? It was working fine when none of you were here earlier. So I was wondering how it would work when all the bodies were in the room. So Dr. Mosley, Jamal, thank you so much for that nice introduction. Let me kind of fill in a little bit about my intro, just so you know a little bit more about me. I consider myself a classroom teacher who happens to be doing education consulting work and authoring books. I was a classroom teacher for 15 years in public schools. So I taught for 6 years in East Lyme, Connecticut, which is down in the southeast corner, kind of near Mystic and New London. And then I taught in Portsmouth, New Hampshire for 9 years. I taught 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades, kind of bouncing around from year to year. I've also worked in a preschool program. When I was in college, we had a lab preschool program, and I was able to work there all 4 years I was in college. I've taught graduate level classes at the University of New Hampshire. So I've really had an opportunity to work in a lot of different settings, which has been fantastic. And I am so excited to be here this morning to wish you all a Happy New Year. I think this is one of the few professions where we actually get this amazing restart. End of August, beginning of September, it's like we get a fresh beginning, and we have an opportunity to craft our teaching anew, and I think that's an incredible, incredible thing. And so I'm here to share a couple of ideas with you this morning that I think will be kind of a nice kickstart for the year. There are kind of some big ideas that I want to push people to think about, and then I also have some practical strategies for you to go out and try right away. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Benna Kalick. She is also an educator, a lifetime educator. She and Art Costa came up with the Habits of Mind framework. So I had a chance to meet Benna recently at a conference, and she was talking about the importance of not overloading people with information. She said, you know, Mike, if you give people too much to think about and not enough time to digest it, people get cognitive indigestion. So I'm going to work hard at not giving you cognitive indigestion this morning, which means that I'm going to give you a few things to think about, and then you're actually going to get to turn and talk with 1 or 2 people nearby and digest a little bit. Think a little bit about what I've said, maybe I'll answer a question. So in order to get us back together, I'm going to use ye old hand signal. I bet a lot of you use this in your classrooms or in your schools. So when you've been talking and it's time for us to come back together, I'm just simply going to put my hand up. And that's going to mean it's time to wrap up conversations fairly briefly and bring your attention back down here. You don't have to put your hand up with me, although it would help if some of you did, because that'll cue in everybody else that we're coming back together. So we'll go ahead and use that as a strategy this morning to give you a chance to think and talk together a little bit, and then to be able to come back together. All right, so my overall topic this morning, I don't think is going to come as a huge earth-shaking idea to anybody. The basic idea of this talk is that the world is changing. It's not surprising to hear this. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have noticed that kids coming to school today are different than kids were 10 years ago? Okay, so this is not big news. Kids are being raised differently. Certainly, the fact that kids are, having access to devices at a very early age is changing the way kids grow and develop. Family structures are changing and growing and developing. And I'm not necessarily saying that any of this is either good or bad. There's probably a mixed bag there. But I think it's just important that we recognize that our children are changing. That means that if we're trying to teach kids who are coming into school today with the exact same structures and strategies that seemed to work 10 or 20 years ago, we can probably predict that it's not always going to be successful. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember at the beginning of the year. There are other ways that the world is changing. The world of work is changing. Here's an interesting statistic I heard just recently. Would you believe that 10% of the US workforce already, right now today, is comprised of freelancers and contractors? 10% of the US workforce are already engaged in working for themselves. And when I first heard that, I kind of went back to my Auburn, Maine 4th grade self, and I went, nuh-uh. No, sir. Can't be. But then I thought, well, wait a minute. I'm one of those people because I'm working as an independent education consultant. I've started an LLC. I'm a company of one. My wife is one of those people. She's also a former classroom teacher who now teaches knitting. She teaches 7 classes a week in both Dover and Durham. We live in Durham. Her brother, Steve, is a website designer and developer. So he lives in a house in Durango, Colorado, but he works for companies all over the place doing website design work. And his wife is a freelance editor. And as I thought about that and thought of some other people I knew who worked for themselves, I thought, okay, maybe 10% is not so far off. So here's another crazy stat. Some economists are estimating that within 10 years, 50% of the US workforce could be working for themselves. No longer working for organizations and for companies. Now, traditionally, in US schools, which you all know were modeled on the factory system of the industrial age, right? We know that's the system we've inherited. Typically, the way to be good at school as a kid is to be really, really good at doing what other people tell you to do. If you're compliant, if you're obedient, if you do what teachers say in the way in which teachers say to do it, then typically you're successful in schools. And so if our goal was to raise generations of kids who are really good at doing what other people say, I'd say we're probably overall doing a pretty good job. However, what if half the workforce aren't going to be working for other people? What if half the workforce are actually going to be working for themselves? If they need to be managed and motivated by other people, they might be in a lot of trouble. Additionally, even the people who are working for companies, who are working for businesses, the skills of compliance and obedience are no longer at the top of the list of what employers are looking for. A buddy of mine works in the tech sector. He's in a company on the south side of Boston. And he said one of his greatest frustrations with the people that he manages is the people who come to him always asking, is the work good enough? I'm reminded of my 4th graders who used to come up to me with their pieces of work saying, hey, Mr. A, do you like it? Hey, Mr. A, is it good enough? So when people go into the workforce and what they're trying to do is sort of do whatever their bosses or managers tell them to do, those are actually not the people who are most successful. When you look at the lists of skills that employers are looking for in employees, it's about creativity, collaboration, empathy, creative problem solving, being able to work with challenging people. Those are the transferable skills that all people are going to need. And especially as automation and outsourcing continue to shift our job market, as a lot of those sort of rote linear jobs disappear, it's going to be more and more important that all kids get a chance to experience and practice the skills of relationship building and empathy and collaboration. Another way the world is changing is that content itself is shifting. When I turned 40, 7 years ago, my nephew gave me a t-shirt that said, when I was your age, Pluto was a planet. I remember when I was a kid being taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America. It wasn't until I grew up that I thought, wait a minute, how do you discover a place if there are already people living there? We learn new things all the time. Content shifts and changes. There is more content now than there ever has been before. I forget the statistic. You've probably heard it. It's something like the amount of information in our world doubles every 8 years, and it may even be faster than that. That's why this is called the information age. So there's more information ever before, and we all have access to more information than anybody has ever had before. You all have in your pockets and in your purses devices that allow you to look up core content if you need to know it. How many years did I teach American history as a 5th grade teacher? I still can't tell you when the Boston Tea Party was. I know it happened, a few years before the Revolution, 72, 73, somewhere in there. But if I need to know it, I can just ask my phone. So one of the things I think we need to consider as we think about the world is changing and so should school is what are the main goals of a good, strong education? I think there's some shifts we need to consider, and I don't believe that what we need to do is flip schools upside down, shake it out, and start all over again. I think we've got an incredibly good structure and a great beginning already, but there are some things we might consider. Do all kids need to know the exact same vocabulary words? Does everybody need to know who Max Planck was? Does every kid need to read the Red Badge of Courage? So one of the things we're going to talk about a couple of ideas now this morning, and a couple of practical strategies that we can use to shift what we've got and make it more resonant and applicable for kids as they're moving into this new age. So we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of big ideas. Before we do that, I'm worried you're going to get cognitive indigestion if I go too much further. So we're going to do about a 1-minute partner chat, about 60 seconds, to turn to one or two people nearby and just share a little of your thinking about what I've shared about how the world is changing. Go ahead. All right. By a show of hands, how many of you want your students to be self-motivated? All right, if you did not just put your hand up, the rest of us are silently judging you right now. Of course we want our kids to be self-motivated. We want our kids to have energy coming from within. We want them to tackle their schoolwork with passion and ownership. And self-motivation is one of those key transferable skills that they're going to need whether they work for somebody else or whether they work for themselves. And it's one of those skills that's going to help them be successful in the world of work after school. So one of the things that I think we should do is we should stop trying to motivate kids. Because when it's our job to motivate kids, where's the self-motivation? And one of the things that schools have done really well for a long time is create systems to motivate kids. In elementary schools, we do things like give kids stickers for doing a good job. Or we give them lots of sort of teacher-pleasing praise for doing good work. As kids get older in middle schools and high schools, we give them grades to motivate them. Study after study after study has shown that these kinds of motivators actually decrease intrinsic motivation in the long run. They may motivate in the moment, but when we tell kids, if you do lots of reading over the summer, you'll get pizza certificates, they might read more that summer, although probably if they're getting certificates for every book they read, if they've got any brains at all, they're reading the shortest books they can. So already we can see a flaw in that system. But the studies show that although they might read more books in the summer, their joy and love of reading will decrease over time. So one of the things that we need to do is work at tapping into self-motivation. So up on the screen, you'll see some of the key intrinsic motivators that we are all born with. And these are the kinds of things that we can work at nurturing in our classroom teaching. To foster a sense of belonging, we can make sure all kids know each other's names. and we can help them feel like a part of a team. One activity I did once, as I was struggling with a scripted math program in my own teaching, which sort of beat the joy and love out of learning math. So I often veered away from that program. So we were supposed to work on prime factorizations. And I looked in the workbook that we had, and I thought, oh my gosh, this just does not look like it's going to be a whole lot of fun. We've got to do something different. So we wrote all of the numbers, 1 through 100, up on a dry erase board in our classroom. And our team challenge as a group of 5th graders was to see if we could come up with a prime factorization for every number 1 through 100. And so for 40 minutes, students were working together. They'd go up when they finished one, they'd write it on the board, they'd go and get another number, and they'd work on that, and they'd write it on the board. We all practiced working on prime factorizations through this collaborative team challenge. And they felt this sense of connection and belonging with each other as they did this cool work. And oh my gosh, it was so much more fun than what that workbook page, was going to have us do. We can work at building in a sense of purpose into daily work. Instead of kids turning in a piece of writing to simply get scored on a rubric or be given a grade and then have the paper turned back, what if instead kids were engaged in publishing writing to a blog, or writing letters to the local newspaper, or creating anthologies in the classroom? One of my favorite things to do as a classroom teacher was to have us all write poetry or write cool science fiction and fantasy stories and then put them all together into a class book that we could then share with families. That gave the work a real sense of purpose. Now we're just not writing to sort of meet an assignment, but we're writing to share it with other people. We can work at tapping into a sense of mastery. It feels good to see yourself growing and learning. So what if instead of us being the ones to create the rubrics and us being the ones to always do the assessing of learning in the rooms, what if kids had an opportunity to co-create rubrics with us? What if they were setting goals and saying, here's what I want to learn, here's a challenge I want to put forward for myself, and then doing more self-assessing? This kind of thing taps into kids' innate desire to grow and learn. We should also just make sure that the work itself is fun. It's always important, I think, for us to put ourselves on the other side of the classroom when we're coming up with an assignment or we're about to do a piece of work and say, if I were a 12-year-old on the other side of this equation, would I want to do this work that we're about to do? I remember once I was working with a group of 3rd grade teachers in Western Massachusetts, and they were complaining that their kids were squirrely. And I said, squirrely? What do you mean squirrely? And they said, well, they just can't sit still. They're looking out the window, they're poking each other, they're talking all the time. And I thought, okay, they sound 8. And I said, well, tell me more about that. And one of them said, look, I can put them right here at this round table, and I could just have 5 of them. And I'm trying to do a math lesson with them, and they can't even listen to me, they can't even pay attention. And so my question was, well, is that work that you're talking about fun? And she said, well, it's the next lesson in the math program. I said, right, but if you were an 8-year-old on the other side of the table, would you want to do that work? And she looked at me with this kind of confused expression, and she said, but Mike, it's the next lesson in the math program. I think we may be in trouble if we forget to see the schoolwork that our kids are doing from their perspectives. So a challenge I have for all of you is to think about the work kids are doing and to answer that question, would you want to do it? And then finally, we can tap into a sense of autonomy. When we allow kids to choose some of what they learn and how they learn it, when we give them some control and ownership of the work, it's amazing what can happen. So let me tell you a short story about a time when many of these factors came together in my own room, and then you're going to get a chance to share and talk with somebody else about a piece of work you do with kids that's super awesome. So in our 5th grade class in Portsmouth, we were studying conflict in U.S. history. And the way we were doing this was that kids had a chance to study something they cared about. Every kid took on an independent research project, and they were learning about people or events from conflict in U.S. history and putting together independent research projects. And so they were excited about the projects. They were going to be sharing these with other people. And I remember it was a Friday morning, and Timmy from my class came up to me about midday, and he said, Mr. Anderson, are you going to be here tomorrow? I said, well, tomorrow? You know it's Friday. You mean, am I going to be here at school on Saturday? And he said, well, yeah, I know that sometimes you come into school on the weekends. Are you going to be here tomorrow? This was before I had kids. So I did go to school a lot on the weekends. And I said, well, I wasn't planning on it, but I got work to do. Yeah, I guess I could come in. Why? He said, because this model of Little Round Top is taking so much longer than I thought, and I really need to work on it. We're doing presentations next week. And I was like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, I'll come in. How about I'll be in from 8 to 12, and if you want to come in and get some work done on your project, you can do that. He's like, oh, thanks, Mr. A. A kid nearby says, whoa, wait a minute. Timmy's coming in tomorrow? And I said, yeah, he needs to do work on his social studies project. He said, well, I got a lot of work to do. Can I come in tomorrow too? So I said to my class, all right, everybody, I'll be here from 8 to 12. If you want to come in tomorrow to do some extra work on your research projects, you can come on in. Just have your parents drop you off at the door in the back of the room. 11 kids showed up on a Saturday morning to work on their conflict and U.S. history research projects with bewildered parents opening the car door saying, Emily said she can come in. Are you sure this is okay? How cool is that? This was, by the way, a non-graded assignment, just in case you were wondering. So let's do another turn and talk. What's an example of a piece of awesome work that your kids get to do that you can't wait to facilitate with your students, and maybe something that taps into one of these intrinsic motivators? All right, a couple of more thoughts to throw your way, and then we'll head on out, because I'm sure if I were in your shoes right now, I would be enjoying this, clearly, but also really eager to get back and get going in classrooms and schoolwork. And so let me just share a couple of more ideas, and then we'll go ahead and break. So a part of all this great work that we need to do, and it goes hand in hand with great academic teaching, is we have to remember the importance of relationships, that relationships matter. It's really hard for good learning to happen in the absence of relationship. Many high school teachers have probably heard the adage, kids don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I was sort of going through this talk last night, and my daughter was looking over my shoulder. She's 15, she's gonna be a sophomore. And she looked at that, she's like, what does that mean? And I explained it, and she nodded, like, oh yeah. It's the teachers that kids connect with who they learn the most from. And so at the beginning of the year, we want to remember to learn kids' names early and use their names often. Make sure we're pronouncing names correctly. When I had students in my class who were Vietnamese, or students who had names that I wasn't familiar with, they would often try and say, oh, it's okay, Mr. A, if you don't quite pronounce my name correctly. And I would say, no, it's not. No, pronouncing names correctly is incredibly important. We need to take time to get to know our students beyond just their academic capabilities. Don Graves, who was one of the grandfathers of the writing process, used to have a great activity he would do, and I've done this a few times in schools, and it's really interesting. Once you get a month into the school year, try this. If you're an elementary school teacher or a self-contained teacher, you might do it with your whole class. If you're a special area teacher or a middle or high school teacher, you might do it with one group of students. So here's what you do. Without looking at a class list, you write all of the kids' names in a class down the left side of a piece of paper, in the order in which you think of them. Just that is interesting. You know, which students are always right at the top of our minds? And which ones do we struggle to remember? Then, next to each name, write down one thing you know about each kid that doesn't have anything to do with academics. Maybe they like horses. Maybe they live with their grandmother on the weekend. Maybe they moved here from Massachusetts last year, whatever. Then, next to that, you put a check mark next to that piece of information if you have talked with that child about that piece of information in the last couple of weeks. It's a great activity to help us recognize not only how well do we know our students, but how well do they know that we know them. Because it's when they know that we know them that the real power happens. I also think part of building relationships with kids and with facilitating great academic work is that we've got to love the characteristics of the ages we teach. I live in Durham, right next to the university, and there's a small apartment building next door to us, and we were having a picnic a couple of years ago, sort of to help the college kids understand they lived in a family neighborhood, you know? And so we were meeting and greeting, and there was this one kid who was sitting at the table, and I was talking with him, and I said, so what are you thinking about doing? And he's a sophomore, you know, so he's still figuring it out. He's like, you know, I think I want to be a high school math teacher. And I said, oh my gosh, that's awesome. I'm an educator. You must really love working with teenagers. And his face, I think that he thought that as a high school math teacher, he was going to work with math all day. And hadn't realized he was actually going to be working with teenagers all day. So if you work with teenagers and adolescents, you've got to enjoy the sort of angst and struggle of adolescence. The fact that they can be like little kids one minute and adults the next minute, and then be back to little kids again a few minutes later. I've got 2 teenagers in my house. I'm living that insanity right now and loving it. As an elementary school teacher, I used to love how sort of fiercely passionate about justice 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders could be. They could get so fired up about things, and sometimes they were things that I thought that we shouldn't spend time on, you know, like who was first in the lunch line. And of course, I said ridiculous things to 9-year-olds like, it doesn't matter where you are in line, we're all going to the same place anyway. But if you're 9, it really matters where you are in line. So you gotta love that energy. When I worked in a preschool classroom, I learned to love the spontaneity of young children. How you just never knew what was gonna happen next. There was this one boy in the preschool class I worked in who every morning walked in, and you could see it was how his dad came home from work. His dad was a construction worker. John would walk over, he'd take off his boots, he'd hang up his jean jacket, he'd walk right to the dramatic play area, he'd open up the fridge, take out a bottle of milk, and go, psst, ah, a cold beer. Every morning. And I remember, oh my gosh, one of my favorite stories from that class, there was this little girl who came up to the head teacher, and the teacher was kind of a germaphobe, which makes the story even better. Came up to the teacher and tugged in her pant leg and said, Miss Isberg, I have to use the bathroom. And Nancy, the teacher, said, okay, Janine, well, you're a big girl, you're 3, you can go by yourself. So Janine says, okay. So she totters off to the bathroom. She's in there for about 10 minutes. And the teacher signals to me that she's going to go check and see what's going on. So she goes and looks over the half door, you know, down in. And Janine is sitting in the toilet, naked. All of her clothes are in a little bowl next to the toilet. And the teacher says, Janine, what are you doing? And Janine says in this very matter-of-fact voice, you know, like this is no big deal. She's like, I have to poop, Miss Isberg. You know, like, doesn't everybody poop in the nude? And so Nancy said, okay, well, when you're done, put your clothes back on and come back out and join us in the room. Janine said, okay. 10 more minutes go by. She's still in there, so Nancy motions. She's going to go check. So she goes and looks over the door. Janine is still naked. All the clothes are still next to the toilet. And she's bending over with toilet paper in her hand, bending over to pick up the poop, which is on the floor. So Nancy says, Janine, what happened? And Janine, in a very matter-of-fact voice, again, like this must happen all the time, she said, well, Miss Isberg, I was sitting in the toilet waiting for the poop to come out, and I was biting my toenails, and it came out onto the floor, and now I'm going to pick it up. I mean, if you can't enjoy that sort of thing, you probably shouldn't be teaching preschool. So let me just share one more idea and one more story, and then we'll head out. And it's part of this idea of building relationships with kids and loving the kids we've got. Can we all just be honest with ourselves for a moment and acknowledge that some children are easier to like and love than others? There are some kids who walk through our doors every morning and they make us feel good about ourselves. They smile, they use our names, they tell us about themselves, they ask how we're doing. And there are other kids who walk in prickly. In case you can't see from where you are, that's a picture of a porcupine up there. And you've probably heard of this idea of hugging porcupines. So one of the things I want us to remember is that we need to make sure that we practice hugging porcupines. Because the kids who are the most prickly, the kids who are the ones who are hardest to like and love, those are the kids who most need our love. They most need the opportunity to build relationships that are healthy and positive with adults, because they're often the kids who aren't getting the chance to do that outside of school. On a daily basis, some of our kids see really bad adult behavior modeled for them. Aggression, detachment, and worse. And we've got to remember that these students do not choose to come to us as porcupines. I think about some of my own kids. Bobby did not choose to live in a family where if one kid came home late, all 6 kids got lined up in the living room for the belt line. He didn't choose that. Melanie did not choose to be born to a 16-year-old mother who could barely even take care of herself, let alone her and her younger brother. Jamie did not choose to have his mother die of cancer when he was young and to be left with a father who was a grown-up adolescent who sat around playing video games all night and didn't cook dinner. And Alec certainly did not choose to have a mother who pushed him out of a moving car when he was 5 years old in Prescott Park, who was in and out of prison because of drugs. Alec did not choose to only live with an adult for no more than 10 months at a time for his entire life by the time I got him in 5th grade. These are the kids who need us the most. And it can be hard to hug porcupines. It means we're going to get hurt sometimes. They need a chance to see adults at their best. They've got plenty of adults in their world who are treating them poorly. They need us to be strong and loving and caring and supportive, even when it feels like they might not deserve it because of the way that they're melting down in front of us. So I want to finish today by telling you a story of a porcupine I worked really hard at hugging for an entire 5th grade year. And he's actually one of those few kids who I heard from years later. So John came to me as kind of a mess in October of 5th grade. He was moving from California. He'd been in a classroom where all the kids had been sitting in rows in alphabetical order. He struggled with weight, and he had been bribed with candy and McDonald's food when he was in school. That was how they got him to behave. His family was falling apart. His mother had left his father, and on the way out had said, the father was a truck driver and had been gone a lot. She said, I can't take him anymore, pointing at her son. I raised him for the first 9 years, you raise him for the next 9. And I know this because the first time I met the dad just sobbed for 45 minutes about losing his soulmate. I just handed him tissues. This giant, truck driver with tattoos and a big beard, just crying and crying. So I'll never forget, John came into my room on that first day, and I had a reading loft and a couch, and we had pet snakes, and there were tropical plants, and he's coming from a classroom that did not look anything like this. He walks into my room, and this is how he walks in. Dude, this room is weird. He was hard. For the first couple of weeks, he basically just sat and watched. I let him observe morning meeting instead of joining in, just to let him get his feet under him. But when it was time to go out onto the playground to do artist-writers workshop, we were doing this combined science poetry unit where we were observing nature and writing poetry. He was faking asthma attacks on the way out because he was terrified of writing. He knew how low he was as a writer. And so we'd be walking out and he'd go, Mr. Anderson, I'm having an asthma attack. Well, what do? Call him on his bluff and then, so I'd say, John, go to the nurse. Twice early in the year, he came to me with blood trickling out of his hand and a pencil tip stuck in his hand to say, Mr. Anderson, I gotta go to the nurse. I didn't do this on purpose to get out of math. He would sit 5 feet away from the pencils, where the pencils were in the room, and bellow, Mr. Anderson, I need a pencil. But the most dramatic day happened when we were going to go hike Mount Major. I didn't have enough school personnel to be able to have a one-on-one with John if he had an asthma attack halfway up Mount Major, and I couldn't let this one guy make it so that the whole field trip stopped. So I called up John's dad and I said to John Sr., John's not going to be able to go on the field trip with us. Too out of control right now, we just can't take him. But I've got a great classroom for him to be in. I don't want him to get out of school. He still needs to know he still comes to school. So I've got a packet of work for him. I've got a great room he's going to be taken care of. Bring him on in. And John Sr. said, okay. So the morning of the field trip comes along, and John Sr. walks in. John's sick. He needs to stay home today. Can I have the work? And I thought, oh. But, there's only so much you can do. So I was going through the work with him. Who walks in through the door? John, not sick, in sweatpants. Come on, Dad, what's taking you so long? John Sr. said, I told you to wait in the truck. Get back in that truck. So John rolls his eyes and walks back out. A couple of minutes later, we get a call from the intercom in my room. Mr. Anderson, there's a boy in here crying hysterically and asking for you. John Sr. stands up like this. I said, no, John, cool your jets for a minute. Let me see what's going on. Let me see if I can take care of this. So I walked down to the office. John is sobbing in the office. So he went back out to his dad's pickup truck, as his dad told him to do. His unemployed dad's uninsured pickup truck. Noticed that the parking job was a little off. It's kind of cockeyed in the space. So John slid into the driver's seat, put the keys in the ignition, turned the truck on, put it in reverse, and did $5,000 damage to the district librarian's car, who was not showing her best self in that moment and was having kind of a meltdown in the parking lot herself. John, in the office, hears the principal calling the police. He thinks he's going to jail. John Sr. walks back into the office, hears what's happened, says, that's it, I can't take it anymore, I'm sending you back to your mother in California. So now his mother doesn't want him and his father doesn't want him. Middle of that year, John Sr. came to me crying again. It's about January. He said, Mike, we're having to leave the apartment. My mother's he was living with his mother in the apartment. He said, my mother's about to be evicted because of John's behavior. We got to get out so she can keep her apartment. I've got a place in Somersworth, but I don't want him to leave you. He's finally feeling safe here. He's finally starting to make friends. And I said, well, can you get him here? And he said, yeah, I can still drive him here, but I don't want him to leave your school. I said, well, district policy says that as long as you're actively looking for housing in Portsmouth, John can stay here if you can get him here while you're looking for housing. He said, Mike, come on, I can't afford anything in Portsmouth. I said, as long as you tell me that you're actively looking for housing in Portsmouth, John can stay here. He said, I'm actively looking for housing in Portsmouth. I said, well, thank heaven, because I wouldn't want to lose John. We've come so far. So I always wondered, what happened to this guy? John's one of those students who you just think about forever. And I'd always wonder, whatever happened to him? 2 years ago, I got an email. You ready for this? Dear Mr. Anderson, My name is John Hall. I was in your 5th grade class, 2000-2001. He gave me permission to share this letter, by the way. I just wanted to let you know how much of a positive impact in my life you made. When I came to your class, I had just moved cross-country from California with my dad. I had been a part of my parents' brutal divorce, was riddled with behavioral and abandonment issues, and I needed serious stability. I found that in your classroom, sir. I made friends and learned lots of valuable life lessons I've used to grow into a successful young man. From your class, I went on to 6th and 7th grade in Somersworth, New Hampshire. From there, I finished my education in Farmington, New Hampshire, where I graduated in 2009. In 2010, I moved back to California and went to college. After going to a 2-year school, I tested the waters of being a working class man. I lasted a year before I decided to go to barber school in 2013. I've been barbering since. I'm 25 now. I have a wife, a barber license, and a house in suburban Los Angeles. Everything is just great. Thank you for not giving up on me that year, sir. I just needed some guidance and care. I hope all is well with you, sir. You really changed my life in that short year. God bless, sincerely, John Hall. P.S. Don't mind the typos. After all, I majored in history, ha ha. I know it's a little hard to see, but he actually sent me a picture that I could share, and it's up there, so you can maybe take a peek on the way out if you can't see him. Except for the facial hair, it's just the way he looked in 5th grade. So I hope you have a fantastic start to your year. I hope you think of great ways to give awesome academic work to your students and build relationships, and please, please, please go hug your porcupines.